Welcome to ModPoPLUS for week 6, and that's chapter 7 on the beats and the legacy of the beats. We're intentionally all over the place here, trying to revisit some beat classics, while at the same time extending forward in time to explore several aspects of the beats' influence on later poetry. The beat classics here are Lawrence Ferlinghetti, whom we didn't have time for in the main syllabus, and a bit more of Allen Ginsburg. The Ferlinghetti is a shticky performance piece which is funny and plays fast and loose with merging metaphors of baseball and poetry and race and colonialism. This funny and politically smart and smart-aleck, I would say, kind of beat poetry was actually quite familiar to readers and fans of the beats in the 1950s and 60s. I think this sort of stuff is a little less well-known now. Maybe less well-known now only because it just didn't wear well poetically as opposed to topically over the decades. The Ginsburg here in ModPoPLUS, represented by his singing of one of William Blake's poems of innocence and experience, is a Ginsburg not of the long Whitman lines and plaintive confession of the sort we get in Howl, and which you can get in poems such as Kaddish. This is the Ginsburg who loves the way a poet like Blake pushed the ballad into the realm of visionary romanticism. A later poet such as Charles Bernstein reveres Allen Ginsberg's LP album of recordings of Ginsberg's singing Blake. Charles Bernstein once told me that he'd worn out that LP by repeated playing, that he'd memorized the whole thing. The Bernstein poems we read in the main ModPo syllabus and here in ModPoPLUS don't include his later use of rhyming, metrically regular stanzas, but I urge you to explore some of these poems in Bernstein's book of selected poetry, All the Whiskey in Heaven. And if you read them and then think about it, you can draw another different line from the romantics through the beats to the language poets. Interesting stuff. It's kind of an alternative lineage, but it's the same alternative lineage that I was describing a minute ago, from ballad to visionary romanticism to the avant-garde. Anyway, when I convened a Poem Talk podcast session on Ginsberg's singing of Blake's The Garden of Love, I asked Charles Bernstein to join us, and he and others, I think, are terrific on Ginsberg's Blake. But as a bonus, ModPo people might be able to deduce this special kind of beat influence on language poets, as I say. Then, please reread Creeley's non-beat beat poem, I Know a Man, and watch a video recording made for the teacher resource section of ModPo of Julia Block leading a discussion of how teachers might teach that difficult yet anthemic poem. We also provide a clip from an interactive ModPo webcast on I Know a Man, and another clip, yet another one, from a ModPo webcast in which ModPoers discuss whether there is just one man in the car hurtling down the road in Creeley's poem. You may recall that when we first discussed Creeley's poem, there's a question as to whether the speaker is just talking to himself or whether there's really a conversation going on between two subjects. And then we have a poem by Creeley called The Sentence. The video accompanying that poem is a 20-minute session in which poet-teacher Michelle Taransky leads a group of high school students at the Writer's House through a close reading. Back for a moment to the topic of the beat's adoration of jazz, in particular bebop. This has had another kind of important influence on later experimental poets. To learn about this, we consider Clark Coolidge's amazing jazz poem, Blues for Alice, in which words are deployed not so much to make semantic meaning, but more like modern jazz musical idioms and rhythms, the voice, in short, being an instrument. Blues for Alice is a famous Charlie Parker song, and Charlie Parker's version of bebop was admired by Ginsberg and especially by Jack Kerouac, and Clark Coolidge has written perhaps more insightfully than anyone about Kerouac's jazzy babble flow. And so Coolidge rewriting a Charlie Parker song gives us another view of the later poet's appreciation for beat jazz. There are two other pieces in this ModPoPLUS extension of our encounter with the beats. Both of these two pieces come from the world of spoken word poetry, which flourished in the late 1980s and 1990s and still, of course, holds great sway among many young poets today. Elements of spoken word poetry did arise from the beat breakthrough of the 1950s. Certainly Ginsburg's and others' loud, ranting, wild, emotive stage performances added a new dramatic dimension to the public presentation of poetry, and indeed extended the idea of the poetry reading as an event itself, as an artwork, as an introduction to art, etc., into a realm that new and wider audiences would appreciate. And we explore just a tiny bit of this particular influence on the beats, and here we encounter Edwin Torres, who has described himself as a lingua lisualist. Torres, born in Puerto Rico and brought to the borough of New York City, called the Bronx, in 1989, discovered the scene at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe and fell headlong into it, and soon Edwin was appearing on MTV's Spoken Word Unplugged and was a star of the National Poetry Slam community. Some slam poetry is linguistically straightforward and narrative, its political and ethical views presented in a manner that makes it relatively easy to comprehend. But Torres has mixed spoken word performance with a deep knowledge of his modernist predecessors, and you might say that he is a crossover poet, comfortable in the slam world and the avant-garde poetry world, and in fact helps redefine what avant-garde means and has contributed mightily to the blurring of the lines that might have once separated such worlds. Here in ModPoPLUS, we feature Edwin Torres' performance of Dude Descending a Staircase, and its reference to Marcel Duchamp enables us to discuss that poem in the context of the first rise of modernism. We also here feature two video performances by now alas deceased, once super famous spoken word poet Maggie Estep. Her piece Hey Baby is presented here in two versions, a pure spoken word version, which is an excerpt of the longer piece as it appeared in a promo for MTV on television, and a version with instrumental background that appeared through Rock Video Monthly in June of 1994. The piece was part of her collection called No More Mr. Nice Girl, also dated 1994. Estep was admired for her direct, aggressive, and uncompromisingly modern poetry, which is how Kristen O'Keefe described her in a book subtitled A Guide Tour Through 20 Years of the New York City Poetry Slam. Those qualities, direct, aggressive, and uncompromisingly modern, were of course used to describe the beat aesthetic when it burst onto the scene in the 1950s. And I'll add the word antic, A-N-T-I-C, a word ModPo people will recognize since I often use it to describe the beats. Estep is angry and brilliantly combative and even verbally abusive, but she can also be linguistically very clever and even funny. In Hey Baby, we certainly root for her when she uses words to repudiate the guy who sexually comes on to her. And listen to those words closely, and you'll hear, I think, that they are descendants of the ash can rantings we hear in Ginsburg's Howl, sonorous, metrically emphatic with lots of downbeats on noun strings with lots and lots of consonants and internal rhyming. Maggie Estep speaks in a stream that might well recall Whitman's enthusiasm as filtered through the shame and frankness and ecstasy of Ginsburg. There's another route to Estep's art. Patti Smith was a huge influence on Estep, and her early work as a poet fronting a band owes a lot to Smith, and Patti Smith, of course, was influenced by the beats too, so there's another way we can trace this line. ModPo is unlikely to further follow this particular lineage of Whitmanism through the beats, but it is easily explored by you on your own because so much of the spoken word poetry is represented here by Edwin Torres and Maggie Estep has been recorded and is searchable through YouTube in particular, but also other such sites. Finally, we've included the video recording of 5 contemporary Philadelphia poets reflecting on the influence of the Beats on their own poetry, a discussion that was moderated by ModPo's own Julia Block.